Hey, happy Sabbath.
Happy Sabbath.
Do we need to save a seat for Kevin?
No, he's on call.
Oh, okay. Well, it's not as though it hasn't been just the two of us many a Sabbath.
You got that right.
So I noticed that it's Medical Alumni Weekend this weekend. And that made me think of Kevin and how he's almost done with residency, right?
I know. We are so very close. I mean, he's 4 months away. And it's just a whole anxiety pool at our house. I mean, he probably has quite a few tips he could give Randy on anxiety today. And then I'm just up to here with anesthesia school. I mean, I'm so worried about getting sleep because I'm putting everybody else to sleep.
I was going to say that just getting through is busy and challenging enough, let alone thinking about what you're going to do afterwards, right? Have you thought about where you're going to set up your practices?
I mean, yeah, we've thought about it. I mean, ideally, we've thought about a small town. It's great to raise a family. You know, there's less crime, friendly people. It's just awesome. And, you know, there's cows.
And no smog, right? So along with those cows, what about patients who pay in eggs and loaves of bread? Kind of hard to pay off the student loans with those, right?
Exactly. We're so worried about that. I mean, what if he has enough patients that he's so busy, or what if he doesn't have enough patients? And then what if they're not paying their loans, or their bills like they should, so we can pay our loans and pay off our mortgage and our children and our church family and staying in shape and the family dog?
Whoa, okay. I'm getting dizzy here just thinking about everything. There are no Giselle or Kevin Juniors yet. And no family dog, right? It's been a while since I've been over, but no dog, right? So I think there's a point where it doesn't pay to worry so much about the future. It really is going to work out.
I know, but it's just, it's so hard for me to not worry about things that I don't have control over or I can't predict. I mean, I worry about irrational things. I mean, I worry about if Kevin's so slow at his practice that he has to start seeing male patients.
Kevin's an OBGYN.
I know.
What's he going to do for male patients?
It's irrational.
Okay, all right, if he were to see male patients, then he would be able to schedule a psych eval and a cardiac eval. Those guys would get way more than they pay for.
I know, you make a good point. And even though we joke about it, Sarah, it is a big problem. I mean, I so wish I had somewhere where I could just give up all these anxieties and worries and just unburden them.
You know, I'd like a place like that too. And I think it exists. What did we just hear? There was a reading or a text. It said, cast all of your cares on him because he cares about us.
I know. But it sounds way too easy. And I don't know how that really could apply in my case.
Chances are that some of you this morning are just like Giselle, overwhelmed with different anxieties, rational and irrational. Chances are, in fact, that if statistics are to be believed, there are several hundred people here this morning in worship of this congregation of maybe 2,000, several hundred, that are either recovering from, heading into, or in the midst of a diagnosable anxiety disorder. That's how frequently anxiety disorders are treated in this country. Chances are you might have stumbled into church this morning dragging fear and anxiety behind you. The truth is, the anxiety levels in the United States have risen dramatically over the last 50 years. That is underlined by this quote from a psychologist named Robert Leahy that just stunned me. It literally did. Listen to what Leahy writes. He says, the average American child today exhibits the same level of anxiety as the average psychiatric patient did in the 1950s. Did you catch that? The average child today, same as the average psychiatric patient in the 1950s. Leahy continues writing, we live in the age of anxiety. We have become a nation of nervous wrecks. Imagine that. Now, it's not that there's no reason for anxiety. There are many reasons for anxiety. Certainly in a post-9/11 world, the anxiety and reasons for it are around us every single day. So what is it that we're afraid of? Well, if you go to the Gallup organization and ask them that question, they will tell you that recent surveys indicate that the number one reason for fear in America, the number one reality, rather, that Americans fear is snakes. Snakes. You're afraid of snakes? Then you're in good company. Number 2 on the list, the fear of public speaking. Maybe that's what drove Mark Twain to say there are only 2 kinds of speakers, those that are nervous and those that are liars. He was probably right. And then the rest of the list, well, it's filled with the usual suspects: fear of tight places, fear of the dark, fear of heights, fear of flying. In fact, along those lines, I'm not so sure I fear flying. It's like the man said, it's not flying that I fear so much as it is crashing. I think that's the reality. But then you follow the list of top 10 all the way down to number 10. Number 10 reason, according to recent surveys by Gallup, number 10 reality that Americans fear is going to the doctor. Imagine that. I'm sure there are no physicians here today that fear going to the doctor. Fear, anxiety on every hand. We cannot seem to escape it. Now, what is it that causes our anxiousness? What is it that creates that? A secular psychologist from Harvard University named Dan Gilbert writes about that. I read an excerpt of Gilbert's work this week. He starts what he writes by saying that the human species is set off from other species by one simple reality. And Gilbert says that reality can be pinpointed by finishing this sentence. He calls it the sentence. He says it's the sentence that every professor, every teacher ought to answer because it will reveal where they are. Here's the sentence. Gilbert says, the human being is the only animal that, and then you fill it in. The human being is the only animal that what? Well, I want to read you Gilbert's words while he is saying that how you answer that question will reveal much about you. Here is how he answers it. The human being, he says, is the only animal that thinks about the future. Human beings, he says, think about the future in a way that no other animal can, does, or ever has. And this simple, ordinary act is the defining feature, according to him, of our humanity. In fact, he says, the average adult spends 12% of the day thinking about the future, roughly 1 in every 8 hours. We can imagine events years into the future. If more than several minutes are involved, no other animal can keep up with us. Now, it's true that Christ's followers may take issue that that's the only difference between us and other animals, but he nevertheless makes a very valid point. We think about the future. We wonder about the future. We worry about the future. We wonder what's out there, what will happen to us. In fact, I have come to believe that the anxiety and the worry that we experience, much of it, if not all of it, can be traced back to 2 simple words, 2 small, short words. In fact, if you're aware of feeling anxiousness, if you're aware of feeling anxiety, follow that trail inward all the way to the trailhead. And at the genesis of that anxiety, you may discover that there are 2 simple words. What if? What if? What if? So maybe Gilbert is correct. Maybe it's that ability to think about the future and the what ifs of the future that creates anxiety within us, because the truth is we are a nation awash in fear and anxiety at much higher levels than we have been in past generations. Now, don't misunderstand. We are not the first people to know anxiety and fear, not by any stretch. In fact, there were members of a group of churches about 2,000 years ago who knew not only the experience of anxiety, but knew the reasons for it. They were a group of Christ followers who knew that persecution was lurking just around the bend. In fact, not only was it in the future, there were those in their midst who had experienced persecution in their past. There were even those who had paid for their faith with their blood. And as the future turned increasingly dark, they must have known the realities of that gnawing fear at the pit of your stomach, that large question mark looming over the future that we call anxiety. And that's the reason that their pastor, a pastor named Peter, wrote them a letter. He wrote them a letter about how to experience suffering as a Christian. He gave them wise, Spirit-inspired counsel about how to order their footsteps, about how to direct their lives under the sovereignty of God. Here is how you face it. Here is how you live within it, wrote Peter to his beloved congregations. We know that as 1 Peter, his first epistle. An epistle to which I invite you to take your Bibles and turn. It's page 1810 if you reach for a pew Bible, or if you're turning on your phone or your tablet. Look for today's New International Version. Because we're going to go to the 5th chapter, 1 Peter chapter 5, to a section where he is actually writing to the elders of the church. And he is saying to them, you, even though you too may know the difficulty of suffering and the anxiety that precedes it, you be an example in how you live and you conduct your lives so that those who are in your churches may take confidence. It's in that context that he writes 2 short verses. I want to read these 2 verses, but as we read them, I want you to pay attention to what he has to say about anxiety. Because I think he's pointing us in 2 directions. First of all, he has something for us that he wants us to do. Secondly, he has something that he wants us to know. And the something that he wants us to know will help us do the something that he wants us to do. If you followed all that, then you're ready to read. 1 Peter chapter 5, we begin reading with verse 6. It says this, humble yourselves, therefore, under God's mighty hand, that he may lift you up in due time. Cast all your anxiety on him because he cares for you. First of all, something that he wants us to do. He says, cast all your anxiety on him. Now, in the original, that word cast is an active, vibrant, strong, assertive word. It's not just a gentle laying down of something. It's not creeping into the prayer closet and trying to lay something down softly and gently and quietly and then sneak away from it before it follows us out. No, it's a word that is muscular and brawny. It means literally to throw, to heave, to launch something. In fact, if we were a gathering of farmers reading Peter's words in its original language, here is probably the image that would come to mind. We would see a pasture where there were hay bales scattered throughout the pasture. We would see a big truck pulling up there and a brawny cowboy getting out of the truck and see him setting about his work. The hay bales wouldn't be the real big kind. They would be the smaller ones that weigh somewhere between 60 and 130 pounds. Heavy enough. But here's this steely, sinewy cowboy, and we watch him as he grasps hay bale after hay bale, and then muscles taut, he rises up and launches them into the bed of the truck. Over and again, picking up that weight and launching it, casting it. That's the picture. That's the imagery of Peter's word. Casting all your care on him. Now, we have a hard time doing that. I have a hard time doing that. I remember some years ago praying with a good friend of mine. He was praying for me over some things I was facing, some decisions I had to make. We prayed together, particularly he prayed for me. After we said amen, he looked up at me and he said to me, "Now, can you leave it there?" And that really irritated me because I wanted to pick it up and carry it with me. If I didn't carry it with me, who would? It's hard to just leave it there. And it's not a matter of just leaving there. Remember, picking that up and casting it. As I was perusing and thinking about lingering over these words this week, an image came to mind. Curious the way sometimes our past is contained in snapshots that we remember. I had a memory of just a few months before I left home for college. Our family was living in Guatemala City at the time, and I was riding a city bus that day. That's how we got around. We rode the buses, and many times those buses would lurch down the street, swaying this way and that, packed far beyond their capacity. On that particular day, it wasn't that full. I was seated, we pulled up to a stop, and I watched as a woman got onto the bus. She was carrying one of those big baskets. She was either coming from or headed to the market, and she had this big basket filled with fruit. I could tell just the way she came up the steps, it was a heavy basket. She paid her fare. About the time she paid her fare, the bus lurched off down the street, swaying. She wobbled and staggered down the aisle to the nearest empty seat. I remember watching her fall down into that seat and take that large, heavy basket of fruit and just plop it right down in her lap. Clutch it close to her chest. And I remember thinking, even as a kid in my late teens, I remember thinking, lady, if you just take that basket and set it on the floor, the bus will carry you and your burden too. It's strong enough. That's the image I had of that woman sitting there clutching. Wait a minute. That was me sitting there clutching my burden after prayer. And Peter says, no, Randy. What I want you to do is I want you to take that load and with all that is within you, launch that into the flatbed of God's grace. Cast your care upon Him. Now, as we read this passage, you may have noticed something interesting. It's easy in reading the passage to think that Peter is just tending to odds and ends, and that we are reading different subjects in his conversation. Because you noticed, after all, first of all, in verse 6, he's talking about humility. And then in verse 7, he's talking about anxiety. And it's easy to think, well, he's just dealing with different matters, but not so. Understand that Peter is very closely and tightly tying together the concepts of humility with the ability to cast our cares upon Christ. It is, says Alistair Begg, the Scottish preacher, as if he is saying, unless you are humble, you will not be able to cast your care upon Christ. Now you understand why. Because so many of us think, I need to take care of this. I need to deal with this. I'm the one in charge. I am key to this. It's all about me. Scripture has a word for that. The word is pride. As long as we're thinking it's all about me, it all depends on me, it is as though Peter says, while you are in that frame of mind, there is no way you will be able to cast your care on Him, because you will be convinced if you let go of it, something bad is going to happen. So he says, before you come to dealing with anxiety, get on your knees in humility and recognize the fact that God is still on the throne. Recognize the fact that God still runs a universe. Recognize the fact that no one died and left us God. And that when that happens, When we have that kind of humility that says, I am not the only cog in this experience, I am not the only one upon whom things depend, then, says Peter, you will be much more able to launch your cares away from you in the direction of God's grace. Alistair Bay continues to remind us about flying on a plane. It got me to thinking about that. Do you remember the last time you flew? This is the age of high anxiety when it comes to flying. You may remember the anxiety that built within you as the day drew near. You weren't looking forward to this at all. But finally the day came. You went to the airport, boarded the aircraft, you sat down, you went back, 23B, aisle seat. I don't want anything in my way if I have to get out of this plane. Where's the exit row? You're taking note of all of these realities, these details. You know nothing about flying a plane, but you are anxious and worried. The flight attendants get up, they do their pre-flight routine, and you are watching intently, but as you look around, you realize no one else is. You're the only one that is paying attention. Finally, the moment comes, you swallow your heart, the plane takes off, it climbs rapidly, and then finally, a few minutes later, comes the time when the plane levels off. And then a voice comes over the speaker. It's deep and resonant, rich. It says, this is Captain Smith up in the cockpit. We have reached our cruising altitude of 38,000 feet. It looks like our trip will be a smooth one. I'll be turning off the fasten seatbelt signs. Feel free to move about the cabin. While you're seated, please keep them attached. Our crew will be happy to help you with any details. And since it looks like it's a clear flight, I won't be talking to you again until we begin our descent. And then he says, do you remember his next words? So sit back, relax, and enjoy the flight. Now let me ask you a question. Are you going to do that? Sit back, relax, and enjoy the flight? Or are you going to try to fly the flight from 23B? It all has to do with how we understand ourselves. If I can have the humility to recognize there is nothing I can do from 23B to keep this flight in the air, it becomes much more possible to cast my anxiety on the pilot and to recline my seat both inches and get some rest. And that is the reality at which Peter is driving. He says it requires humility to be able to cast your care on Him and to realize it doesn't all depend on me. There is something He wants us to do. It's that first thing He says in verse 7, cast all your cares on Him. But there's not only something in this passage that He wants us to do. There is secondly, something He wants us to know. And He wants us to know this because He realizes that knowing this will help us do what He just told us to do. He wants us to know something. And so He has that final phrase of verse 7. You read it right there, 1 Peter 5:7. Cast all your anxieties on Him. Why? Because He cares for you. Because He cares for you. It strikes me that part of what drives our anxiety about any reality in our lives is the sense that we are the only ones who really, truly care about this. If we don't care about it, who is going to care about it? I am the one that is worried about board exams. I am the primary one affected. If I'm not worried, nobody's going to worry, and something bad will happen. I'm the one worried about whether or not my business is going to survive. I'm the one worried about, well, you fill in the blanks, because no one else cares enough to think about it, worry about it, pray about it. And then Peter says, cast all your anxieties on Him because He cares for you. We were young parents, had just become parents a few weeks, maybe a couple of months before that. Austin was just a little crumb cruncher. Actually, he wasn't a crumb cruncher. He was more like a gum cruncher. He had no teeth yet. Just a little bitty tyke. And Anita and I were going out for the first time on a longer date. Not a date just around the corner and down the street to the restaurant nearby. We were going all the way to L.A. It was going to be the whole evening. Hours we would be gone. Well, as young parents, that caused no small degree of anxiety. How would we care for Austin? So Anita called up a good friend of hers from college, someone we knew, someone we trusted, someone who was exceedingly capable, someone with whom we could leave Austin and trust that he would be cared for. And then we discovered something interesting about young parenthood. We discovered that we were still worried. We were still worried about this and that and getting into the car. Well, did you do? Oh, no. We run back in. Well, let's make sure about this. Let's make sure about that. Can you? And she was like, just go. Just go. I'll take care of it. Oh, but we've got to worry because we're the only ones really concerned about this. And Peter says, cast all your cares, your anxieties on him because he cares for you. Now, I want you to notice what this text says and what it does not say. It says, he cares for you. It does not say he will resolve all your problems in the way you wish. It does not say he will make your house payment. It does not say he will take boards for you. It does not say he will do all the studying, all the work required. It does not say any of that. It just gives us that absolute, unequivocal, unflinching, unyielding, unbending assurance. He cares for you. So you don't have to worry so deeply and so much because so many times we do. We echo the thoughts and the words and the questions of the greats of Scripture. The psalmist who said, God, don't you care? Are you still up there? When are you going to act? Are you always going to be silent? Do you care? We echo the words of Habakkuk. Habakkuk who said, God, look at how your people are conducting themselves. Doesn't it matter to you? Don't you care? We echo Job, who sat writhing and itching and scratching and grieving and saying, God, what did I do? Don't you care? And Peter says, yes, he cares. And the knowledge that he cares will allow you then to cast your anxiety on him. I love the way the J.B. Phillips version renders that last phrase, because he cares for you. J.B. Phillips puts it this way. He says, you can throw all the weight of your anxiety on him, for you are his personal concern. For you are his personal concern. February 4, 1976. I didn't have to look up the date. It is engraved in my mind. Early that morning in the dark pre-dawn hours, an earthquake almost rent the country of Guatemala in two. Although it would take a long period before they would know the numbers, the conservative estimates were that about 77,000 were injured and about 23,000 were killed. We were living in Guadalajara, Mexico at the time, about 1,000 miles to the north. That is, all of us except my brother John, who was living in Guatemala City. John, who would later say at 3:01 a.m., it was as though a locomotive roared through his bedroom and destroyed things in the process. We awakened to news. The news at that time did not come through as quickly as it does today, and it began to seep out the destruction, the devastation, the damage. And you can imagine, as the world began to hear what was happening, the sorrow and the sadness and the anxiety that people felt as tremors continued to shake that country. We felt the same, except for this. In a house where the Roberts family lived, in Guadalajara, there was one who was our personal concern. He was our personal concern. As much as we might have cared what happened to all the others, as much as we prayed for safety and grace and help, there was one who was our personal concern. So much so that it wasn't too many hours later that my father mounted the mission plane that he flew, packed it with supplies and food and medicine and blankets and whatever else might fit, and took off, winging his way southward toward Guatemala City. If you had asked what was in that airplane, we might have told you, well, there's medicine, there's food, there are blankets, there's clothing, there's any supply that would fit. But any of us in that family, in our family, would have told you one other thing. There's a father's heart in that airplane that is yearning, that is longing to see a young man, to embrace him, to say to him, I'm so thankful you're safe because you are my personal concern. Maybe you sit here this morning overwhelmed with anxiety, eaten up with worry. You're stressed out about your marriage, a marriage that is falling apart. There seems no way out. You're overwhelmed with anxiousness about your checkbook. How will you make it? The investments once seemed so good. What about now? You're stressed about upcoming exams as the quarter grows to its conclusion. You sit here with tear-dimmed eyes as you think of the doctor's words just days ago, that grim diagnosis that has so seriously compromised your future. And you staggered into worship this morning, carrying a burden that is too heavy to bear. Well, if that describes you, let me assure you that God has sought different ways to get the message through. Through the Old Testament prophet, he said it this way. He said, yes, even a mother might forget her nursing child, but I will not forget. Why? Because you are my personal concern. Through Jesus, he said, I care about you so much that on long afternoons I sit around counting the hair on your head. Why? Because you are my personal concern. Or the words of that Nazarene rabbi from Galilee who pointed at the birds flitting about in the branches, said, see those sparrows, see them up there, not one of those, not one, falls to the ground without my Father taking notice. And take comfort, you are worth more than many sparrows. Why? Because, says God, you are my personal concern. So take heart this morning as all those pressures cave in upon you. Take heart. Remember, God is still on the throne. Humble yourself in His presence and recognize it doesn't all depend on me. And listen to Peter. Peter, who knew a bit in his own life about anxiety, as he says, cast, throw, launch all your cares upon Him. Why? Because you are His personal concern.